Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast. If you enjoy this content, then perhaps you would consider supporting the channel by signing up to the Tudor Chest Patreon account or via Apple Podcasts, where you can gain access to all subscriber episodes that I also release in conjunction with the main show. For as little as £5 a month, your support is what allows me to continue in running the Tudor Chest and is greatly appreciated. To join, head to patreon.com/the Tudor Chest or search for the podcast in Apple Podcasts, from where you can sign up via their subscription services. Anne Boleyn is Tudor royalty, both literally and figuratively. She is unquestionably the most popular and famous of the six wives of Henry VIII, if not the most popular Tudor all round. It is unsurprising, therefore, that she has been portrayed in film and television many times. But for many, myself included, the greatest and most important depiction of Anne Boleyn on screen came at the end of 1969, when Anne of a Thousand Days was released in cinemas across the world. An epic historical drama based on the life of Queen Anne Boleyn, the film had a little-known French-Canadian actress, Genevieve Bujold, in the titular role, her first film in the English language, alongside the iconic Hollywood legend Richard Burton as Henry VIII. Undoubtedly a product of its time, the film is romanticised and filled with a lot of historical inaccuracies, and yet it remains an enduring beacon around which other Tudor films are often judged. But why so? What is it about this film that stands out? And what can modern storytellers take from this most iconic Tudor biopic? In this week's episode, I will try and answer those questions, taking a look back on Anne of a Thousand Days, how it was made, behind-the-scenes dramas, of which there were many, and why, I believe, it retains such a beloved place in the hearts of Anne Boleyn devotees. Welcome back to the Tudor Chess Podcast, episode 46, Anne of a Thousand Days, the story behind the masterpiece. I am 36, very nearly 37 years old, and so whilst Anne of a Thousand Days came along 18 years before I was born, I am old enough to remember a time before Showtime's 4-series-long The Tudors. Whilst The Tudors and Natalie Dormer's portrayal undoubtedly brought the subject of Anne Boleyn to a whole new audience, Anne of a Thousand Days was my introduction to Anne Boleyn in film and television. And I know that for millions around the world who are fascinated by Anne's story, Genevieve Bujold's turn as the doomed queen remains the definitive depiction of Anne Boleyn. Although the film itself received a mixed critical response, it was nonetheless nominated for 10 Academy Awards, with the work of Genevieve Bujold and Richard Burton, as well as Anthony Quayle, who played Cardinal Wolsey, receiving considerable praise. The two leads would be nominated in the Best Actress and Best Actor categories respectively, but neither would actually win. Of its many nominations, the film only actually took home one Oscar, the Academy Award in Costume Design, which for anyone who has seen the film can clearly see was very, very deserving. The costumes in Anne of a Thousand Days are literally incredible, particularly the gowns worn by Genevieve Bujold. Anne of a Thousand Days would fare much better at that year's Golden Globes award ceremony, in which it would take home both the Best Picture, the big award, and Best Actress, the one and only time an actress has won a major film award for playing Anne Boleyn. Anne of a Thousand Days was produced by the American Harold Brent Wallace, known as Hal Wallace. It would not be his only outing into the realms of the Tudors on screen. For just 2 years after the release of Thousand Days, he followed up with Mary, Queen of Scots, starring Dame Vanessa Redgrave as the doomed Scottish Queen, opposite Glenda Jackson in her second outing as Elizabeth I. A reminder that she had recently played Elizabeth to great acclaim in the 6-part BBC miniseries Elizabeth R. Wallis had actually written the part of Mary Queen of Scots with Genevieve Bujold in mind, but she politely declined, citing a desire to not be pigeonholed into the role of queens who lost their heads. In the first scene that we actually see Elizabeth in Mary Queen of Scots, Hal Wallis produced a deliberate movie Easter egg, calling back a particularly memorable scene from Anne of a Thousand Days. In Anne of a Thousand Days, Henry VIII is hosting a large banquet towards the start of the film for much of the Tudor court, and this is also the point at which his attraction to Anne Boleyn is starting. Anne herself is very cold and aloof. She's annoyed by the king for blocking her plans to marry Harry Percy. We see Mark Smeaton performing a song called Farewell My Love, which we then discover was actually a piece written by the king himself. When Henry VIII asks Anne, "If some young man wrote this song for you, Anne, what would you say of it?" she coolly replies, "I would ask him how his wife liked it, Your Grace." Now, this is one of those historical inaccuracies that I referenced earlier, for no matter how confident Anne Boleyn truly was, there is no way that she would have ever spoken to the king in this manner. And yet, it does stand out as a real sort of crowd-pleasing moment in the film. It is this that is thus revisited as an Easter egg early on in Mary Queen of Scots. Elizabeth is being wooed by her favourite, Robert Dudley, aboard a boat gliding along a river. He sings Farewell My Love to her, and I will include a clip to hear their conversation.
I thought it might amuse you to hear it.
Who wrote it?
It said that your father composed it for your blessed mother, Anne Boleyn, before they were married.
Oh.
It is also said that when he asked her how she liked it, she countered by asking him how his wife liked it.
My God, my mother had the courage of 10, and so have you horse.
I know it's silly and it's entirely fictitious, but as someone who loves both the films, I really appreciated its inclusion. I just thought it was quite clever in a way. Something that is not very well known about Anne of a Thousand Days is that it was actually adapted from a play, and as such it was not the first production of Anne of a Thousand Days to take place. It started out, as I say, as a play on Broadway in New York in 1948, starring a Tony Award-winning Rex Harrison as Henry VIII and Joyce Redman as Anne Boleyn. It is believed that the reason that the film itself was not made until 20 years later owed a lot to the production codes in the USA during the 1940s and 50s. These codes blocked subject matter that would have to be included within the film, that of illegitimacy and adultery. With regard to casting, shocking as it may now seem, Genevieve Bujold was not the first choice for the filmmakers. Instead, Hal Wallis had wanted to cast the British actress Olivia Hussey. With her angular features, large, dark expressive eyes, and long, thick, flowing dark brown hair, Hussey would have made a very good choice for the part of Anne Boleyn, but she managed to talk her way out of the role by an offensive comment that she made about John Wayne, whom Hal Wallis was producing in True Grit. Another altogether different breed of actress was also very interested in the role, Hollywood icon Dame Elizabeth Taylor. Over lunch with Hal Wallis, Elizabeth Taylor told him, "I've been thinking about it for weeks. I have to play Anne Boleyn." Wallis was apparently horrified. He recalled in his diary, "Elizabeth, play Anne Boleyn? Elizabeth was plump and middle-aged. Anne was a slip of a girl." Now, thankfully for Hal Wallis, Richard Burton, who had already accepted the role of Henry VIII, was also present at the lunch, and he took the issue out of Hal Wallis's hands by looking at Elizabeth directly in the face and saying, "Sorry, love, you're too long in the tooth." For anyone who doesn't know what that means, it means she was too old. Any hard feelings that Elizabeth Taylor may have felt were assuaged thanks to Richard Burton's huge salary from the film, which equates to around $25 million by modern standards, as well as cameo roles for Elizabeth, her daughter Liza, and Richard Burton's daughter Kate. Elizabeth Taylor's cameo is certainly a blink and you'll miss it moment, but it's definitely there. As Henry and Anne are hosting a court dance, we cut to Catherine of Aragon at prayer. A man and a woman run in on her, and the woman in question is Elizabeth Taylor. So next time you watch the film, look out for that. Richard Burton was no doubt hired to play Henry VIII, in part because he was Richard Burton, he was an incredible actor, but also because of his great fame, which could only ever help propel the movie forward. The fact that he was relatively slight of frame, not particularly tall, and didn't possess the red hair of Henry VIII were facts that were largely overlooked because it's Richard Burton. When Genevieve Bujold was approached for the role of Anne Boleyn, she was asked to do a screen test, which she refused. A bold move in a relatively unknown actress, and yet it was this that supposedly convinced Hal Wallis that she was right for the part of Anne Boleyn. Bujold herself later recalled that that display of hard-headedness equally matched Anne Boleyn's own spirit. Rounding out the principal cast were Anthony Quayle as Cardinal Wolsey, Irene Papas as Catherine of Aragon, John Colicos as Thomas Cromwell, and Michael Hordern as Sir Thomas Boleyn. From a filming perspective, the movie was a combination of sets in Pinewood and Shepperton Studios, and real-life locations closely associated with Anne Boleyn, chief amongst them Hever Castle, the home of Anne Boleyn as a child. It appears early on in the film with the king visiting the Boleyn family. As the king, atop a horse, saunters into the inner courtyard of the castle, Anne Boleyn gleefully looks down from a window above. Penshurst Place is another prominent location, with a large number of outdoor scenes filmed there. Penshurst actually stands in for Hever Castle and was likely used for its bigger size and more open-plan gardens. Notable scenes at Penshurst are when Henry VIII is playing archery and after firing an arrow requests that a new boat be called the Anne Boleyn. It was also in Penshurst that Anne tells the king that she is pregnant. The film's costumes were designed by Margaret First and truly are some of the most spectacular depictions of Tudor fashion seen on screen. Save a few errors here and there, which is bound to happen, the costumes are practically perfect. The designs worn by Genevieve Bujold, as I said earlier, were particularly stunning. The cut of the materials and the headwear, such as the French hoods and the gable hoods, were just complete triumphs. I'm actually quite forgiving of small inaccuracies with regard to plot points. I'm much more forgiving of it than I am bad costuming, because any historical drama is going to have to embellish the storyline to a certain degree. But with the costumes, we have so many records of how the Tudor fashion looked, thanks to the huge number of portraits and so on, that for me it's just unforgivable to get it wrong. One of the things that I really struggled with about the Tudors and reign in particular were the really awful costumes, because to me it just sort of takes you out of the reality of what they're trying to portray. From a plot perspective, Anne of a Thousand Days opens at the end. That is to say that we see Henry VIII weighing up whether he wishes to proceed with Anne Boleyn's execution. Thomas Cromwell, played by John Colicos, is spurring him on. The king is seen thinking back, crying out, "Anne, Nan." Nan became a nickname that Henry VIII supposedly had for Anne Boleyn, and it is used repeatedly throughout the film. We then jump back a decade to the very first time that the king sees Anne Boleyn at a court dance. She is giddily dancing with her intended, Harry Percy, but very quickly catches the king's eye. Henry VIII instructs Wolsey to break the intended marriage of Anne and Harry Percy apart and to send the Boleyns back to Hever, with the king confiding to Wolsey that he is bored by his court and his Spanish cow. When Anne is informed by Wolsey that her hoped-for marriage to Harry Percy cannot go ahead, she reacts furiously and warns the cardinal, "Although I am only a girl, you will know you have an enemy." When Wolsey informs Anne that the reason for the breakdown of her engagement is owing to the king having turned his eye on her, Anne retorts, "I will not be the mistress of a king, even with the blessing of a prince of the church." When Anne and Henry meet, Anne is rude and indignant, speaking so plainly of her dislike for the king that he furiously orders her to the court to act as a lady-in-waiting to the queen, to ensure that she is constantly under his eye. As the delights of the court, the dancing and the new clothes clearly rub off on Anne, she is shown to soften towards the king, or at least finds herself becoming more attracted to him, and in particular the power that the king exudes. What is interesting is that the improvement seen in the relationship between Henry and Anne on screen was at direct odds with the relationship between Richard Burton and Genevieve Bujold, at least according to Burton, that is. The making of Anne of a Thousand Days came up repeatedly in his acerbic diaries, which were made public a few years ago. Richard Burton had very little good to say of his on-screen star, nicknaming her Gin, for Bujold's apparent habit of turning up to the set hungover and smelling of, well, I think the clue's in the nickname. As a man known for his weakness for the bottle, it was rather like the pot calling the kettle black. Burton also decried Bujold's talent, suggesting that Elizabeth Taylor would have been better, and saying of Bujold that she had all the power of a dying gnat and lacked the spit, venom and arrogance needed to play Anne convincingly. He also suggests that dislike of Genevieve was widespread across the entire production, writing that she had upset nearly everyone and was vulgar and rubbish. Now, as best I can tell, Genevieve Bujold has never commented on the remarks made by Richard Burton. The only juicy bit of gossip that we have from Bujold herself was her response to the fact that Elizabeth Taylor kept showing up to the set, supposedly concerned that Richard Burton and Genevieve Bujold were having an affair. On one particular day, she showed up and Genevieve Bujold snapped. She was incensed because it was the day of the very powerfully charged scene in the Tower of London towards the end of the film. She told the film's director, Charles Jarrett, "I'm going to give that bitch an acting lesson she'll never forget." Now, I must admit, I've always been quite shocked by Richard Burton's comments. Anyone who has seen Anne of a Thousand Days can see quite plainly that Genevieve Bujold played the role of Anne Boleyn with intense power, or to use Burton's words, spit, venom and arrogance. As far as I see it, she gave an acting masterclass, and so either Richard Burton had unbelievably high standards, or he lashed out, recognising that his 27-year-old co-star, largely an unknown, stole the entire film from under his feet. Certainly, he later commented that he hated the film and was shocked when he was nominated for an Oscar for Best Actor. Richard Burton was undoubtedly a genius, but his diaries come across as filled with jealousy and spite, and cast something of a petty streak across his memory. However, back to the film itself. Anne Boleyn is shown as eventually falling in love with the king. They marry after a lengthy legal battle against Catherine of Aragon, and we see Anne's coronation procession through London. The film provides the very first example of seeing Anne Boleyn's coronation procession on screen, and follows the belief that the people of London were incredibly hostile towards her. Not long after, Henry and Anne's happiness is dealt a crushing blow with the birth of Elizabeth, not the hoped-for son, and their marriage soon begins to wane. Anne refuses to sleep with the king unless he puts Sir Thomas More to death for failing to acknowledge her position as queen. Just as the axe lands on More's head, Anne screams out, having lost her subsequent pregnancy, delivering a stillborn boy. The king, now repelled by his wife, orders Thomas Cromwell to find a way out of the marriage. We then see Cromwell torture Mark Smeaton by having knotted rope twisted into his temple. Whilst playing with her 2-year-old daughter Elizabeth, Anne is visited by her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and informed that she is arrested. At first shocked, she then realises that the Duke of Norfolk is not joking, and she runs to Elizabeth and holds her in her arms. She is then escorted to the Tower of London and informed that she is there on a charge of adultery. Anne looks down from a window and sees the men arrested alongside her, including her own brother. A look of complete horror crosses Anne's face as she knowingly says,
"Incest. Oh, God help me, the king is mad. I am doomed."
We then go to the trial of Anne Boleyn. The trial of Anne Boleyn is one of, if not the most historically inaccurate part of the film, although I must admit it is a gripping scene nonetheless. Anne furiously upbraids the assembled crowd, telling them,
By what lawful authority am I called here? I am your queen, and as such share the king's immunity from arrest and trial.
Now, sorry to bring it back up, but talk about spit, venom and arrogance, Richard Burton. In a heartbreaking and entirely fictitious scene, George Boleyn is also brought forward into the stand alongside his sister, and then their father is called forward to act as a witness to confirm their identities. Mark Smeaton is called to the bar to provide evidence, but is plainly terrified and only acting in accordance with Cromwell's demands. Spotting this, Anne asks the Duke of Norfolk, who is presiding over the trial, if she can question Mark, which he grants. She approaches the musician, telling him, "I know well you have been tortured, but tell them the truth, Mark. Have courage." With Mark refusing and saying 3 times that he slept with the Queen, suddenly Henry VIII appears, having been listening in from behind a wall. He approaches Mark and the Queen and clearly sees straight through Mark's lies. When Smeaton is told that he will die either way, he finally acknowledges that there had been no improper conduct between him and the Queen. Mark Smeaton is led away, and Anne, hopeful, looks at her husband's face, gently smiling. Sadly, it becomes all too clear, however, that this is not enough, for the king looks at Anne and says, "Still, could be true." As I say, the trial is highly inaccurate. There is zero evidence of Anne being given the right to cross-examine anyone, and we know beyond doubt that the king did not intercede. The last time that he and Anne Boleyn met was the day prior to her arrest. Condemned to death, we see Anne in her chambers at the Tower, looking from a window as a scaffold is built below. She sits down and decides to recount the days that she and the king spent together. Using wooden markers, each representing 100 days, Anne says, "The days we bedded, married, were happy, bore Elizabeth, hated, lusted, bore a dead child, which condemned me to death. In all, 1,000 days, just 1,000. Now, the eagle-eyed will notice an error here, or in film speak, a blooper, for in Genevieve Bujold's hands were not the 10 markers needed to reach 1,000, but 9 to match the 9 things that she recounted. But let's not let that spoil a good story, from which the film itself drew its name. In truth, Anne Boleyn was actually queen for 1,085 days, but alas, that doesn't really have the same ring to it. What comes next, although again entirely fictitious, is perhaps the greatest part of the entire film, and is the reason why I believe the film is so beloved, and also why Genevieve Bujold's performance as Anne Boleyn is so iconic. The king visits Anne, wishing to know from her own mouth as to whether there is any truth to the accusations. She retorts, "Have you fallen into your own trap, my lord? Any evidence you have against me, you yourself bought and paid for. Do you now begin to believe it?" When she tells the king that his presence is pleasing to her eyes and heart, Henry VIII softens and offers her a deal. If she agrees to annul their marriage and give up all rights as queen, he will allow her to leave England and take Elizabeth with her. Anne sees straight through Henry's offer, knowing well it is being given to her so that the king can marry Jane Seymour and in turn render their daughter illegitimate. Anne refuses, telling Henry,
Once I told you any children we had would not be bastards. You promised marriage and the crown. Now you try to dance out of your promise. Well, I won't have it. We are man and wife together, king and queen. I keep that.
Henry retorts by shouting in anger that Anne's decision will see her put to death. And from here, that best scene that I referenced a moment ago plays out. Anne spits out to the king,
Before you go, perhaps you should hear one thing. I lied to you. I said I love you, but I lied. I was untrue with many.
That is a lie.
It is true. I was unfaithful to you with all of them. With half your court, with soldiers of your guard, with grooms, with stable hands. Look, for the rest of your life, at every man that ever knew me, and wonder if I didn't find him a better man than you. But Elizabeth was yours. Watch her as she grows. She's yours. She's a Tudor. Get yourself a son on that sweet, pale girl, if you can, and hope that it will live. But Elizabeth shall reign after you. Yes, Elizabeth, child of Anne the whore, and Henry the bloodstained lecher, shall be queen.
Now, obviously this is a very made-up scene. Most agree, myself very, very much included, that Anne Boleyn was innocent of all of the charges against her. But even so, this scene is filled with such electricity and power that it is easy to overlook the inaccuracies. I think for many, we would have loved Anne Boleyn to have been given that moment to really tear Henry down to size, which is why I think it remains so iconic. As the scene closes, Anne breaks down in tears, and we then cut to the king signing her death warrant. Anne is seen at prayer prior to her execution. She greets Sir William Kingston and utters the famous little neck quote. Anne is escorted to the scaffold, and in a break from accuracy, her scaffold speech was completely cut from the film. I suspect that the speech she delivered moments earlier to the king was deemed sufficient enough to please the audience, giving Anne a moment to say all that she thought. The overall execution is also much smaller in scale, with perhaps only 20 spectators, Cromwell prominent amongst them. It is also the only depiction of Anne Boleyn's execution, at least to the best of my knowledge, in which drummers are there as well to sort of drum as Anne is about to be beheaded. Anne kneels and the expert executioner swings down with the sword, killing her in one blow. We see a cannonball go off and cut to the king, who can hear it from the distance, ordering his entourage to Mistress Seymour's, knowing well that his second wife is now dead. Princess Elizabeth is seen in the grounds of Penshurst, walking away from the camera as Anne Boleyn's rant to Henry VIII about Elizabeth being a great queen is replayed over the top. And with that, the credits roll. Anne of a Thousand Days is easily my favourite film based on the Tudor period. I first saw it at quite an apposite age. I think I was about 10, and I was studying the Tudors at school. I told my mum that I was really interested in Anne Boleyn, and by pure chance, on that very afternoon, Anne of a Thousand Days was on the TV. She allowed me to watch it, which at the age of 10 I think is still quite young for a film which included beheadings, but she allowed me to see it. And from that moment, I was just totally entranced. The film has unquestionably played a major role in my lifelong fascination with Anne Boleyn, and as I've said, Genevieve Bujold's depiction of Anne remains my favourite and a firm favourite with many fans. Even Genevieve Bujold herself retains a slight claim over Anne Boleyn. When Susan Bardo, who is the author of The Creation of Anne Boleyn, was writing her book, she reached out to Genevieve Bujold and was surprised to receive both a response and a willingness to talk about the film. When Bardo asked Bujold if she believes that any actress could match her portrayal, Bujold supposedly paused for a few seconds, then looked at Susan Bardo straight in the face and said, "Never. Anne is mine." And I couldn't agree more. Bujold truly is the greatest Anne Boleyn ever seen on screen, in my opinion. Yes, the film itself is filled with inaccuracies, but her portrayal of Anne, contrary to Richard Burton's acerbic conclusions, conveyed everything that I believe the real Anne Boleyn possessed. Pride, glamour, strength, wit, cleverness, boldness, and yes, venom, spit, and arrogance. One of the other touches that Genevieve Bujold brought to the role was her accent. As a French Canadian, she speaks English with a slightly unusual quality. That isn't to say that her accent is strong, but it's clear that there's something else going on. It's not straightforward English in the way that I speak, for example. And given Anne's lengthy stay on the continent as a girl, I rather suspect that the real Anne Boleyn spoke English with a slightly affected tone. To this day, Anne of a Thousand Days remains legendary with fans of Tudor England, from the stunning set designs, the jaw-dropping costumes, and the quality of the acting talent assembled. It is one of the most important and often quoted sources when assessing the Tudors on screen. If you're listening to this but you haven't seen it, then please stop whatever you're doing, go over to Amazon Prime and rent it for $3.99. You have to watch Anne of a Thousand Days. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chess Podcast. Thank you so much for listening. In next week's show, I'm going to be speaking to my friend and colleague, Dr. Sarah Morris, all about the relationship between Anne Boleyn and her daughter, Elizabeth I. I also have episodes coming up with Dr. James Taff about his latest book, Serving the Tudors, and very excitingly, a discussion with Cynthia Hand, all about her amazing creation, My Lady Jane, which has been adapted for a series on Amazon Prime, which has been released to critical acclaim. Look out for all of these in the coming weeks. Thank you again for your support of the Tudor Chest, and speak soon.